Hey everyone, tonight we are stepping back into a world where the most dangerous sound in the empire was in. The roar of a cannon or the clash of curved blades, but the rhythmic, metallic thud of a heavy spoon hitting the bottom of an empty pot. You are standing in the center of an Ottoman encampment at twilight, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and rendered lamb fat. Around you, thousands of elite soldiers, the Janissaries, are not cleaning their muskets or sharpening their killage swords. Instead, they are staring intently at a massive blackened copper cauldron known as the kazan. To these men, that pot isn't just kitchenware, it is their heart, their flag, and their god. If that pot is full, the sultan is safe. If it's upside down, the empire is about to burn. You probably wouldn't survive the first week of this life, mostly because you'd likely faint from the sheer weight of the ceremonial headgear before you even got to the grueling labor of the mess hall. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're listening from tonight, so please post your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are no longer sitting in your room. You are a recruit in the mid-17th century, standing in the sprawling barracks of the Topkapi Palace. The sun is dipping below the horizon, painting the golden horn in shades of bruised purple and gold. Your stomach rumbles, a reminder that in this army, loyalty is a biological function. You look toward the Kazanke Zarif, the noble cauldron. In any other military history, we talk about the front lines or the vanguard, but here, the most prestigious units are literally named after kitchen staff. You aren't just a soldier. You are part of an okok, which translates to hearth. Your colonel isn't called a colonel. He is the korbak, or the soup maker. The mainstream historical fact that often gets glossed over is that the Janissaries were the first modern standing army in Europe since the fall of Rome. While European kings were still scrambling to hire smelly, unreliable mercenaries every time a border dispute popped up, the Ottoman sultans had a professional, salaried, and most importantly fed force ready to go at a moment's notice. But there's a quirky, fringe tidbit that really sets the scene. Your uniform actually reflects this obsession with the kitchen. On your high felt cap, the birk there is a small wooden slot. In a modern army, that might hold a plume or a badge. For you, it holds a large wooden soup spoon. You literally wear your cutlery as a badge of rank. To lose your spoon was as shameful as losing your rifle. As you stand there, the steam from the communal pilaf rises in thick plumes, wrapping around the pillars of the barracks. You hear the clatter of the karakuluku, the scullery maids, who were, ironically, some of the toughest trainee soldiers in the world, as they haul sacks of rice and lentils. Historians still argue whether the Janissaries' obsession with food was a genuine spiritual devotion to the sultan as the provider, or if it was a calculated political tool used by the soldiers to hold the monarchy hostage. It's a bit of a chicken or the egg scenario, except in this case, the chicken is seasoned with saffron and the egg is part of a delicate lemon sauce. You feel the weight of the tradition pressing down on you. This isn't just about nutrition, it's about the salt covenant. By eating the sultan's salt, you are bound to him by an invisible, unbreakable thread. But you notice something tonight. The men around you aren't reaching for their bowls. There is a silence that feels heavier than the humid Istanbul air. Usually, the sound of 5,000 men eating is a chaotic symphony of wooden spoons against ceramic. Tonight, the only sound is the crackle of the fire. You look at your korbak, he isn't serving the soup. He is standing with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the palace walls. This is the central paradox of your existence. The kitchen is where your loyalty is forged, but it is also where your rebellion is cooked. In the Ottoman world, the kitchen was the nerve center of the state. If the Janissaries were unhappy with a new tax, a failed campaign, or a grand vizier they didn't like, they didn't send a petition. They didn't go on strike in the streets. They simply refused to eat the sultan's pilaf. They would march to the center of the square and overturn their massive copper cauldrons with a deafening clang. That sound was the death knell for many a sultan. It was the ultimate one-star review, and it usually ended with someone's head on a silver platterand. I do mean as a garnish. You remember the stories the older soldiers told you. They talked about the time the kitchen fires went cold during the reign of Osman II. The young sultan had tried to cut the meat rations, thinking he could save a few silver aki. He forgot that a Janissary's belly is the barometer of the empire's health. You see, the sultan wasn't just a ruler, he was the father who feeds us. When the bread became sandy or the mutton became lean, it wasn't just a bad meal. It was a breach of contract. As you stand in the flickering firelight, you realize that the logistics of this army are what truly make it terrifying. While the Crusaders of old often starved to death before they even saw the walls of Jerusalem, you have a literal meat administration dedicated to your caloric intake. There are entire guilds of butchers, bakers, and water carriers whose sole job is to follow you into the mountains of Hungary or the deserts of Persia. You are part of a machine that treats a bag of chickpeas with the same strategic importance as a keg of gunpowder. You take a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the evening meal. It's a mix of lamb, cracked wheat, and a hint of cinnamon. It's comforting, yet there is a sharp edge to the atmosphere. You look down at the spoon tucked into your cap. It feels heavy today. You wonder if, by the end of the night, you will be using it to eat, or if you will be watching that great copper kazan roll across the courtyard, signaling the end of an era. The kitchen is waiting, the sultan is waiting, and the history of the world is simmering in a pot of soup. You weren't always a warrior with a spoon in your cap. You were once just a boy in a dusty village, watching the horizon for the dust clouds of the sultan's officials. This is the beginning of your journey through the Devshirme the Gathering. You might imagine that being taken from your home to serve a distant emperor would be a purely somber affair, but for many, it was the only ticket out of a life of subsistence farming. You trudge along the winding mountain paths of the Balkans, one of a long line of tribute children. You are being harvested like a crop, but instead of being ground into flour, you are being refined into the empire's steel. You probably wouldn't survive this hike today, not without your moisture-wicking socks and a GPS. But for you, in the 17th century, the destination is everything, the imperial kitchens. So, as you walk, let's talk about the reality of your transition. Before you ever touch a musket, you are introduced to the hierarchy of the hearth. The mainstream historical fact is that the Devshirme system was the backbone of Ottoman power, providing a loyal administrative and military class that owed everything to the sultan rather than to landed nobility. It was a meritocracy of the most intense kind. But here's the quirky fringe tidbit. Your first test of character wasn't a duel or a test of strength. It was often how you handled the communal tray. If you were too greedy, you were seen as undisciplined. If you were too timid, you were seen as weak. You were literally judged by your table manners before your marksmanship. Historians still argue whether the Devshirme was a cruel form of enslavement or a prestigious social elevator that families actively tried to bribe their way into. For you, standing in the shadow of the massive palace gates for the first time, it feels like both. You are stripped of your old name and your old life, and in their place, you are given a new identity centered around the okok, the hearth. You are sent to work on a farm or in a kitchen to build your muscles and learn the language. You spend your days hauling massive sacks of lentils and learning the exact temperature required to simmer a pot of lamb without toughening the meat. You are a novice Aesimio clan, and your life is a cycle of labor and steam. You see the older Janissaries passing by, their white felt caps towering over you. They look like giants, their mustaches waxed, and their gait confident. They don't look like soldiers so much as they look like the masters of the house. You realize then that the Sultan's palace is just a giant house, and the Janissaries are the household guards who live in the kitchen. In the Ottoman mind, the state wasn't an abstract concept. It was a family, and in a family, the most important room is the one where the food is made. You watch as a senior cook, the Axkabak, barks orders at a dozen apprentices. He holds a massive iron ladle like a scepter. In that moment, you realize the ladle has more power over your daily happiness than the Sultan's sword. The training is grueling. You aren't just learning to fight, you are learning to belong to the bread and salt. This phrase is repeated to you until it becomes a mantra. To eat a man's bread and salt is to enter a sacred contract of protection and loyalty. You spend years in this state of transition, your body hardening as you haul water and wood for the fires that never go out. You are being cooked yourself, transformed from a raw, rural youth into a seasoned instrument of the state. You remember the smell of your mother's hearth, the simple scent of baked rand. You compare it to the complex, spicy aroma of the palace kitchens. The smell of cinnamon, cloves, and expensive butter is the smell of power. There's a gentle sarcasm in the way the veteran soldiers treat you. Careful with that sack of rice. Boy, one might say, that's more valuable than your head to the Grand Vizier. It's a joke, but only barely. The logistics of feeding the Janissary Corps were so precise that a missing shipment of rice could cause a diplomatic crisis. You are learning that the Ottoman Empire runs on a full stomach. You see the massive granaries, the rows of hanging cured meats known as pasterma, and the barrels of olives. This isn't just food, it's the fuel for a machine that is currently pushing the borders of the empire into the heart of Europe. You are eventually assigned to a specific orta or regiment. Each regiment has its own cauldron, its own kitchen, and its own traditions. You aren't just a number in a ledger. You are a member of a mess. You find yourself sitting in a circle with 10 other men sharing a single large dish of pilaf. This communal eating is designed to break down your individuality. You learn to eat at the same pace as your brothers-in-arms. You learn to watch their hands, to anticipate their needs. This is the secret of the Janissary battlefield coordination. If you can share a bowl of soup in perfect harmony in the dark of a barracks, you can hold a pike line in the chaos of a cavalry charge. As you graduate from your apprenticeship, you are finally given your own soup spoon. It's a simple object, carved from boxwood or bone, but to you, it's more precious than gold. You tuck it into the band of your cap with a sense of pride that is hard to explain to an outsider. You are no longer the boy from the mountains. You are a son of the sultan, a man of the hearth. You look at the massive copper kazan in the center of the courtyard, and you see your reflection in its polished surface. You are part of something vast, something ancient, and something that is defined by the heat of the fire and the weight of the ladle. The sun sets over the palace, and the call to prayer echoes through the streets of Istanbul. You take your place in the line, your spoon tucked securely in your cap. The air is cool, but the heat from the kitchens radiates through the stone floor, warming your feet. You are ready. You have been gathered, refined, and seasoned. Now, you wait for the command to eat, knowing that as long as the Sultan feeds you, you will fight for him. But even now, in the back of your mind, you remember the weight of the cauldron. You know that the same pot that feeds you can also be the instrument of your defiance. For now, though, the lid is on, the steam is rising, and the empire is at peace. You are now a full-fledged member of your orta, and you've begun to realize that your world isn't governed by generals or colonels in the way the West understands them. No, you live in a military meritocracy that sounds more like a high-end catering firm than a lethal fighting force. As you walk through the barracks, you pass the quarters of your superior officers. You don't salute a major. You show deference to the aşçi-başi, the head cook. You don't look for a captain. You seek out the çorba-başi, the soup maker. Even your sergeant carries the title of Baz Karagaluku, or the head scullery maid. It's a hierarchy that would make a modern Michelin-starred chef nod in approval, though your kitchen has a significantly higher body count. You probably wouldn't survive a single shift under the aşçi-başi. His ladle is unjust for serving it, a disciplinary tool that can crack a skull as easily as it stirs a stew. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Janissary Corps used culinary metaphors for every single aspect of their organizational structure. The entire corps was known as the ocak, the hearth, and their primary unit of assembly was the kitchen. This wasn't some cute nickname, it was a fundamental philosophy of statecraft. In the Ottoman view, the Sultan was the provider, and the soldiers were his guests. But there's a quirky, fringe tidbit that adds a layer of surrealism to your daily life. The actual insignia of your rank is often an embroidered vegetable or a kitchen implement. Some high-ranking officers even wore silver-plated ladles at their waists, where a European officer would carry a ceremonial sword. You are literally part of an army that marches on its stomach and ranks itself by the menu. Historians still argue whether this culinary nomenclature was a relic of the Janissaries' humble origins as household servants or a deliberate psychological tactic to create a family bond that superseded ethnic and religious ties. For you, leaning against the cool stone wall of the mess hall, the why matters less than the what. What matters is that your soup maker is responsible for your life, your pay, and your dinner. If he's a good soup maker, your boots are sturdy and your mutton is fatty. If he's a bad one, you might find yourself eyeing the palace gates with a heavy heart and an empty stomach. You watch your çorba-başi now. He's inspecting a shipment of wood for the fires. He doesn't look at the grain for building. He looks at how it will burn steadily, slowly, enough to keep the massive cauldrons simmering for 16 hours straight. The atmosphere in the barracks is one of disciplined domesticity. You see soldiers mending their socks near the hearth, while others are tasked with the sacred duty of peeling onions. This isn't considered KP duty or a punishment, it's a ritual. In the Janissary world, the kitchen is the temple. To insult the food is to insult the sultan. To waste a grain of rice is a sin against the okok. You via heard the jokes from the city folk that the Janissaries are just warrior cooks, but they do unsay it to your face. They've seen what happens when the soup makers draw their blades. A ladle can be a scepter, but a cleaver is still a cleaver. There is a strange, quiet dignity in this. In the European armies you've heard about, the soldiers are often treated like disposable cattle, fed moldy bread, and left to forage in the mud. But here, you are an elite. You are the Sultan's own. You see the soka, the water carriers, entering the courtyard with their leather skins. They are the lowest rank, yet they are treated with immense respect because they bring the lifeblood of the kitchen. You realize that in this army, everyone is a cog in a great steaming machine. There's a gentle sarcasm in the way you greet the water carrier. Careful, brother, if you trip, the soup maker might have to serve us wine, and we know how the Sultan feels about his tab. It's a risky joke, but in the heat of the hearth, humor is the only thing that doesn't boil over. As you move through your day, you notice the symbolic power of the kazan again. It sits on a raised stone platform, the copper polished so brightly it reflects the flickering torches like a second sun. When the Janissaries are summoned to the palace to receive their quarterly pay, the ceremony is centered around, you guessed it, a meal. You march in formation, not to a parade ground, but to the palace kitchens. There, you are served a luxurious pilaf, topped with saffron and tender pieces of lamb. This is the yulaf ceremony. If the soldiers eat the pilaf, it means they accept the Sultan's pay and his authority. If they leave the trays untouched, well, that's when the soup maker stops making soup and starts making history. You remember a veteran telling you about a time when the pilaf was served with too little butter. It sounds like a petty complaint, doesn't it? But to the Janissaries, it was a signal that the treasury was empty, that the Sultan was weak, or that the Grand Vizier was skimming off the top. A lack of butter wasn't a culinary mistake. It was a political declaration. You look at the butter currently being melted in a smaller pot gold, shimmering and fragrant. It looks like peace. It looks like stability. You realize that your entire career is a delicate balance of spices. Too much salt, and the men grow thirsty for blood. Too little meat, and they grow hungry for change. The bell for the evening meal rings a clear, resonant tone that cuts through the chatter of the barracks. You take your place in the circle. Your spoon is ready. As you dip it into the communal bowl, you feel the heat of the food and the presence of the men around you. This is the hierarchy of the spoon. You eat in order of seniority. A silent dance of etiquette that reinforces who is the master and who is the student. You are a small part of this massive, hungry family. You are a soldier of the hearth, and as long as the soup is hot and the Sultan is generous, the empire will stand. But you can't help but glance at the heavy copper lid of the cauldron, wondering just how much force it would take to flip it over. You are standing in the shadow of the great supply wagons, watching a line of camels stretch toward the horizon like a slow-moving river of leather and spice. This is the Ottoman logistical miracle, the invisible engine that keeps the Janissary heart beating. While your counterparts in the West are often reduced to chewing on their leather boots or looting local villages until there's nothing left but ash, you are part of a system that treats the delivery of a sourdough starter with the same urgency as a delivery of fresh arrows. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer boredom of the baggage train, where the pace is set by the slowest ox and the most stubborn mule. But this slow-motion parade is exactly why the Sultan's enemies tremble. They know that while they are counting their last bags of moldy grain, you are sitting down to a meal of warm bread and honey. The mainstream historical fact is that the Ottoman Empire possessed the most sophisticated military logistics system in the world from the 15th to the late 17th century. They established a network of way stations called menzils, which functioned like a high-speed rail system for food, housing, grain, livestock, and fresh water at regular intervals along the main military roads. But here's the quirky fringe tidbit. The Janissaries actually had a dedicated biscuit administration, the production of peximet, a twice-baked hardtack. was so vital that the Sultan Kudan did seize every oven in Istanbul to ensure the army had enough bread for a campaign. You aren't just a soldier, you are the beneficiary of a statewide bakery takeover. Historians still argue whether the sheer scale of this logistics machine eventually became the empire's golden handcuffs, making it impossible to campaign beyond a certain distance from the central granaries because the cost of feeding the supply animals began to outweigh the benefits of the conquest. You see this tension every day. You watch the menzelki, the station masters, frantically checking their ledgers as thousands of sheep are driven past. If a single flock goes missing, the paperwork alone could sink a minor official. It's a bureaucracy of calories, a world where the ledger is mightier than the sword, because a sword couldn't cut through the hunger of 60,000 men. You trudge along the imperial road, the Orta-Kol, and you notice the discipline of the march. There is no chaotic foraging. If a soldier is caught stealing a single apple from a local orchard, the punishment is swift and often involves a very painful introduction to the bastinado. Why? Because the Sultan wants the local populations to see the army as a customer, not a predator. You carry your own weight, but the heavy lifting is done by the thousands of specialized laborers. You see the ekmekabaki, the chief baker, overseeing portable ovens that are assembled and disassembled with the speed of a modern pit crew. The smell of rising dough in the middle of a mountain pass is a psychological weapon. It tells the enemy that you aren't just passing through, you've brought your home with you. There's a certain sarcasm in the way the veterans talk about the meat. Every province you pass through has been preparing for your arrival for months. They owe the Sultan a hospitality that is paid in sheep, cattle, and rice. "Look at those fat cows," your tent mate might remark, pointing at a herd in the distance. They've been waiting their whole lives just to become Janissary stew. It's a noble end, really. It's a dark bit of humor, but it reflects the reality of your privilege. You are the elite, and the empire will bankrupt itself to ensure you don't have to hunt for your own dinner. You see the water bearers, the Saka, again. On the march, they are the most popular men in the regiment. They carry massive leather skins filled with water that has been treated with a dash of vinegar or lemon to keep it from spoiling. It's not the finest wine, but in the heat of a Balkan summer, it tastes like life itself. You realize that your combat effectiveness is directly tied to the moisture in your throat and the salt in your bread. The blood, bread, and Sultan's bounty isn't just a poetic phrase, it's a biological contract. If the Sultan provides the bread, you provide the blood. It's a simple trade, and so far, the exchange rate has been in your favor. The camp is set up tonight with the precision of a clockwork toy. The kitchens are always the first things to be established. Before the tents are even fully pitched, the fires are lit. You watch the smoke rise, 1,000 gray fingers reaching for the sky. It's a signal to any scout watching from the hills. The Janissaries are here, they are fed, and they are ready. You sit by your unit's kazan, the copper still warm from the journey. The logistical miracle has succeeded once again. You have traveled 300 miles, and yet your dinner is exactly the same as it was in Istanbul. As the sun sets, you receive your portion. It's a hearty stew of mutton and chickpeas, served with a side of that legendary pexamit. The bread is hard enough to break a tooth if you are uncareful. You learn to soak it in the broth first, but it is honest food. It is the fuel of conquest. You look around at the vast sea of tents, the flickering fires, and the endless crates of supplies. You are part of the most wealthy juggernaut in history. But as you chew the tough meat, you think about the cost of all this. You think about the millions of sheep, the endless fields of grain, and the thousands of men whose only job is to make sure you stay full. The Sultan is a generous father, but you know that fathers eventually expect a return on their investment. You find yourself standing before the most sacred object in your entire regiment, and no, it isn't a holy book or a golden idol. It is a massive, soot-stained copper pot. You are looking at the kazank zarif, the noble cauldron. To an outsider, it's just a vessel for boiling rice and mutton. But to you, it is a living entity, a repository of the regiment's honor, and a silent witness to centuries of history. You probably wouldn't survive the shame of what happens if this pot is captured in battle. A Janissary who loses his cauldron is a man without a soul, a soldier who has essentially been deleted from the imperial ledger. You watch as a younger recruit tries to touch the rim with a greasy hand, only to be swatted away by a veteran. "Treat it like your mother's face," the old man growls, and he isn't joking. The mainstream historical fact is that the Janissary cauldrons were the functional equivalent of a Western regiment colors or standards. In battle, the cauldron was placed in the center of the formation, guarded by the most veteran soldiers. If the cauldron fell, the unit was considered disbanded. But there's a quirky fringe tidbit that highlights just how deep this obsession went. When a Janissary was promoted or moved to a different unit, he didn't just sign a paper, he had to symbolically marry the new hearth. The cauldron was the bride, and the soldiers were its eternal protectors. You aren't just eating out of this pot, you are in a committed relationship with it. Historians still argue whether the veneration of the kazan was a remnant of ancient Turkic shamanism, where the hearth was a portal to the spirit world, or a clever psychological anchor created by the early sultans to ensure the men remained tethered to their barracks. For you, the scholarly debate is white noise compared to the physical reality of the thing. You see the dents in the copper, each one a story of a narrow escape during the siege of Vienna, or a skirmish in the Caucasus. The kazan is a physical record of your regiment's survival. It has been hauled over mountains, floated across the Danube, and dragged through the mud of a dozen countries, always remaining the center of your universe. There is a strange, almost religious etiquette surrounding the cauldron. When it is moved, it is carried by two men using a sturdy wooden pole, and the rest of the unit must stand at attention as it passes. To turn your back on the kazan is a sign of extreme disrespect. You see the soka bringing fresh water to fill it, performing their task with a solemnity that borders on the ritualistic. There is a gentle sarcasm in how you view the civilian pots in the city markets then. Flimsy things that would buckle under the weight of a real soldier's meal. Those are just toys, you mutter to your comrade. Our kazan has seen more blood than a surgeon's knife and more fire than a blacksmith's forge. The kazan is also the site of your most important oaths. When a new batch of recruits is fully inducted, they don't swear on a sword. They swear by the bread and the salt prepared in that very pot. You remember your own induction, the steam rising into your face, the smell of the sultan's bounty filling your lungs. In that moment, the cauldron wasn't just a pot, it was a promise. It promised that as long as you were brave, you would never be hungry. It promised that you belonged to a brotherhood that the world feared. It is the ultimate symbol of the Salt Covenant, a bond that turns a collection of orphans and tributes into the most disciplined fighting force on the planet. But the kazan has a darker side, one that the Sultan and his advisors watch with a nervous eye, because the pot is the symbol of the unit's collective will. It is also the symbol of their collective anger. You've heard the whispers about what happened during the reign of Murad IV. When the soldiers were unhappy, they didn't just grumble, they gathered around the kazan in total silence. A silent kazan is more terrifying to an Ottoman official than a shouting mob. It means the guests are no longer happy with the host. You look at the lid, a heavy piece of hammered copper. It's sitting firmly in place right now, but you know that if it were to be flipped over, it would be the start of a political earthquake. You see the axkabak polishing the rim with a piece of rough cloth. He handles it with more tenderness than he shows his own children. To him, the kazan is the source of his authority. Without the pot, he's just a man with a ladle. With it, he is the high priest of the regiment. You realize that the Ottoman military isn't just a collection of men with weapons, it's a collection of hearths. Every orda is defined by its fire and its pot. If you were to lose your way in a nighttime retreat, you wouldn't look for a flag. You would sniff the air for the specific scent of your unit, stew, and look for the silhouette of your kazan. As the moon rises over the camp, the kazan reflects the silver light, looking like a giant, grounded star. You feel a sense of security being near it. It is the one constant in a life of constant movement and violence. Campaigns come and go, sultans rise and fall, but the kazan remains. It is the anchor of your identity. You tuck your spoon into your cap and give the copper side a small, respectful tap as you pass. It rings with a deep, hollow sound, the heartbeat of the empire. You are a Janissary, a man of the noble cauldron, and tonight the hearth is warm. The atmosphere in the barracks has shifted from the usual bustling hunger to a heavy, suffocating stillness. You are standing in the middle of the Etmedani, the meat square of Istanbul, and for the first time, the smell of wood smoke doesn't bring a sense of comfort. Usually, this is where the sultan's sheep are slaughtered and distributed. But today, the butchers are idle and the soldiers are gathered in a tight, grim circle. In the center of the square lies your kazan, but it isn't sitting on its tripod over a roaring flame. It is lying on its side, its polished copper belly exposed to the sky, looking like a dead animal. This is the overturning of the cauldrons. You probably would unsurvive the next hour if you were a palace messenger trying to cross this square, because an overturned pot is a declaration of war against the throne. The mainstream historical fact is that the Janissaries utilized their culinary symbols to conduct one of the most unique forms of political protest in history. They didn't need to shout slogans or hang banners. The act of refusing to eat the sultan's pilaf and flipping the cooking vessels was the ultimate no-confidence vote. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit: the Janissaries actually had a strike menu. Depending on the severity of their grievance, they might first refuse the meat, then the rice, and finally the ultimate insult, the bread. To refuse the sultan's bread was to officially sever the salt covenant. You are currently standing in a square where the bread is being trampled into the dust, and that means someone in the palace is likely going to lose their head before sunrise. Historians still argue whether these rebellions were a sign of the Janissaries, growing democratic power within a rigid autocracy, or simply the beginning of a parasitic decay that would eventually hollow out the empire. For you, clutching the hilt of your Yatagan sword, it feels like a desperate necessity. The silver ackee in your pouch have become thin and debased. They buy half the mutton they did 3 years ago. You see your korbak, the soup maker, standing over the fallen kazan. He isn't barking orders for dinner. He's pointing his ladle toward the Topkapi Palace. The Sultan has forgotten who feeds his glory, he snarls. In this moment, the kitchen has become a fortress, and the cooks have become revolutionaries. There is a terrifying ritualism to this chaos. You hear the rhythmic banging of spoons against the metal sides of the pots, a clanging, metallic roar that echoes off the stone walls of the city. It's a sound that makes the shopkeepers of Istanbul bolt their shutters, and the Grand Vizier check the locks on his secret escape tunnels. You remember the sarcastic jokes from last week about the watery soup, but nobody is laughing now. The sarcasm has sharpened into a jagged edge of resentment. You are part of a mob that is defined by its shared appetite. And right now, you are hungry for justice, or at least for the head of the official who dared to skimp on the butter rations. You see the younger recruits looking to you for a signal. They are frightened, but they are also energized by the sheer audacity of the act. To overturn the kazan is to break the most sacred rule of the okak, yet it is the only way to be heard. You realize that the Sultan's power is an illusion that only exists as long as you agree to sit down and eat. The moment you stand up and flip the table, the hierarchy vanishes. You aren't just a soldier anymore. You are a kingmaker. You look at the palace in the distance, its minarets piercing the gray sky. Inside those walls, the Divan Council is likely panicking, trying to decide which official to sacrifice to appease the hungry lions in the square. This is the first course of a rebellion, a recipe for a coup that has been perfected over centuries. You've heard the stories of the bloodthirsty sultans who tried to fight back, but even they knew that you can't fight an army that refuses to be fed. If the Janissaries won't eat, they won't march. If they won't march, the borders fall. It's a simple, brutal bit of leverage. Historians often call this period the Sultanate of the Janissaries, a time when the kitchen staff effectively ran the government. You feel the weight of that power in your hands. It feels heavier than any musket you've ever carried. As the sun begins to set, the banging of the spoons reaches a crescendo. The Saka are no longer bringing water for the soup. They are bringing torches. The fire that usually simmers the lamb is now being used to light the way to the palace gates. You take one last look at your kazan, lying cold and empty on the cobblestones. It looks lonely, it looks wrong. But you know that until the Sultan comes out with a tray of gold and a promise of better meat, that pot will stay exactly where it is. The kitchen is closed, the chef is on strike, and the empire is about to be served a very different kind of meal. You join the march, the metallic clang of 5,000 spoons ringing in your ears like a funeral bell. You aren't thinking about the salt covenant anymore. You're thinking about the blood debt. Every time the Sultan tried to save a penny on your rations, he was adding a link to the chain that is now pulling him toward his doom. You are a Janissary, and tonight, you aren't waiting for the dinner bell. You are the one ringing it, and the sound is enough to wake the dead. The first course of rebellion is served, and it's a dish best served cold in the shadow of an overturned pot. You are standing in the middle of a bustling Istanbul street, but the air doesn't smell like the usual sea salt and roasted coffee. It smells like tension and raw mutton. You have traded your musket for a heavy wooden staff today, patrolling the stalls of the city's butchers. In the Ottoman world, the price of meat is not just a matter for the household, it is a matter of national security. You are currently witnessing a meat price riot, a phenomenon where the Janissaries become the unofficial regulators of the free market. When the price of a sheep climbs too high, you and your brothers don't write a letter to the editor. You march into the market and negotiate with the guild leaders. You probably wouldn't survive the haggling process here, mostly because a Janissary's idea of a discount usually involves a very sharp blade and a very loud threat. The mainstream historical fact is that the Ottoman government exerted strict control over the prices of essential goods, a system known as nar. This wasn't just to keep the poor from starving, but specifically to keep the Janissaries from revolting. If the cost of living in Istanbul rose, the Janissaries' fixed salary became worthless. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The Janissaries were so protective of their meat supply that they had a specialized meat intelligence network. They knew exactly how many sheep were crossing the Danube months before they reached the city. If the numbers looked low, the barracks started to buzz like a disturbed hornet's nest. You aren't just a soldier, you are an armed price control officer. Historians still argue whether the Janissaries' constant interference in the Istanbul markets helped maintain social order by preventing price gouging, or if it stifled the economy by scaring away honest merchants who didn't want to be bullied by work. From your perspective, standing over a trembling butcher whose prices have accidentally doubled overnight, the answer is simple. The Sultan's soldiers must eat, and they must eat well. You look at the mutton carcasses hanging from iron hooks. To the average citizen, they are dinner. To you, they are the currency of your loyalty. If the butcher can't provide the meat at the nar price, you've been authorized to distribute it yourself. It's a terrifying form of social justice, flavored with garlic and fat. You see the Grand Vizier's men scurrying through the crowd, trying to calm the merchants before a full-blown riot breaks out. They know that if the Janissaries aren't happy with the price of mutton, the meat square will soon be filled with more than just livestock. There is a gentle sarcasm in the way you tap your staff against the butcher's table. My, what expensive sheep they grow in Anatolia these days, you remark with a thin smile. They must be eating gold instead of grass. The butcher doesn't laugh. He knows that your sarcasm is the only thing standing between him and a very unpleasant visit to the barracks basement. The meat price riots were a recurring nightmare for the Ottoman administration. You remember the stories of the great mutton shortage of the 1600s, when the Janissaries actually occupied the city as slaughterhouses to ensure they got their lioness share before the civilian population could buy a single chop. This wasn't just greed, it was about the hierarchy of the hearth. In your mind, the army is the first priority of the state. If the people are hungry, it's a tragedy. If the Janissaries are hungry, it's a catastrophe. You are the guests of the Sultan, and a good host never lets the guests' plates go empty, regardless of what the market says. There is an open, scholarly debate phrase often used here. Historians still argue whether the Janissaries were the protectors of the common man or the greatest obstacle to their prosperity. You see both sides as you walk. You see a widow grateful that you've forced the baker to lower the price of bread. And you see a merchant weeping because his profit margins have been vaporized by a Janissary decree. You are the shadow of God on the streets, enforcing a culinary morality that is as rigid as your military drill. You realize that your power doesn't just come from your training with the bow or the musket. It comes from your control over the city's appetite. As the sun sets over the minarets, the market begins to quiet down. The prices have been stabilized at least for today. You head back toward the barracks, passing the kengel, the great hooks, where the meat is weighed. You feel a sense of grim satisfaction. You have secured the meat for your orta, and in doing so, you have secured the peace of the city for another night. You look at the commoners heading home with their small parcels of food. They don't look at you with love, but they do look at you with a certain kind of relieved awe. As long as you are fed, the city doesn't burn. You return to the hearth, where the fires are already being stoked for the evening meal. The scent of roasting fat begins to fill the air, a reward for your day's work as an economic enforcer. You tuck your spoon into your cap, feeling the weight of the meat price tension slowly dissipate. The Sultan has managed to keep the prices down, the butchers have survived, and the Janissaries are sharpening their knives for dinner rather than for a coup. For now, the stomach of the empire is calm, but you know that tomorrow the sheep will be fewer. the merchants will be greedier, and you will have to go back out into the streets to remind everyone who truly owns the scales. You are standing at the edge of a vast, windswept plateau in the heart of the Balkans, watching the sun dip behind the jagged peaks. The army has been marching for 14 hours, but the work is only just beginning. In any other military force, this would be the hour of chaos, where exhausted men collapse in the mud and pray for a crust of bread. But for you, this is when the mobile kitchen city springs into existence. Within 30 minutes of the halt, the ground is measured, the tents are aligned, and the rhythmic thud-thud of heavy copper pots hitting the earth echoes through the valley. You probably wouldn't survive the transition from soldier to construction worker that this requires, especially since you expected to do it all while carrying 60 pounds of gear and a very grumpy disposition. The mainstream historical fact is that the Ottoman military camp was a marvel of pre-modern engineering and urban planning. It wasn't a sprawling mess. It was a temporary city with streets, markets, and a strict zoning code based on the hearth. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The Janissaries were so obsessed with the cleanliness of their hearth in the wilderness that they had dedicated ash inspectors. If your unit's cooking fire was found to be messy or improperly extinguished, the entire orta could be fined or, worse, have their meat rations delayed. You are a warrior of the Sultan, yet you spend a significant amount of your life worrying about the aesthetics of a hole in the dirt. Historians still argue whether the extreme order of the Ottoman camp was a functional necessity for managing such massive numbers, or a psychological performance designed to intimidate any enemy scouts watching from the heights. To a lonely scout on the ridge, the sight of 10,000 perfectly identical cooking fires igniting at the exact same moment must look less like an army and more like a supernatural force. You see your korbak directing the placement of the kazan with the precision of an architect. This hearth is your home for the night, and in the Ottoman mind, a home must be orderly. A messy fire leads to a messy fight, the veterans say. And you've learned not to argue with men who have survived 5 winters on the frontier. The logistics of this hearth in the wilderness are staggering. You watch the Soko water bearers return from a nearby stream, their leather bags glistening in the firelight. They don't just dump the water into the pot, they filter it through charcoal and cloth. You've heard that in the armies of the infidels, men drink straight from puddles and die of the bloody flux before they ever see a battle. Here, your water is treated like a precious ingredient. There is a gentle sarcasm in how you watch the local peasants staring at your camp. To them, you are a swarm of locusts. To you, they are just a scenic backdrop for your evening meal of lentil soup and fresh-baked ekmek. There is a strange comfort in the ritual of the wilderness hearth, even hundreds of miles from Istanbul. The hierarchy remains. You know exactly where to sit, who eats first, and who is responsible for scrounging the extra firewood. You notice that the officers' tents are placed downwind of the kitchen's not because they want to avoid the smell, but so they can monitor the quality of the cooking. If the scent of the stew is off, the aşçi-başi will hear about it before the sun rises. You realize that your camp is essentially a giant portable palace, and the kitchen is its beating heart. An open scholarly debate phrase often pops up in the accounts of European travelers who visited these camps. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman camp silence was a product of iron discipline or a cultural preference for stoicism. You, however, know the truth. It's hard to be loud when your mouth is full of hikwalami mutton. The silence is the sound of thousands of men being satisfied. While European camps are often described as dens of drinking, gambling, and brawling, your camp is a place of industry and steam. You are a Janissary, and your hearth is a sanctuary of order in a world of chaos. As the night deepens, the kitchen city settles into a low hum. You look around at the grid of fires, each one representing a brotherhood bound by bread and salt. You feel a sense of immense pride. You aren't just an invader, you are a civilization on the move. You carry your laws, your god, and your kitchen with you. You take a bite of your rashana piece of preserved beef called pasturma that has been spiced with enough garlic to ward off an evil eye. It's salty, tough, and tastes like home. You wrap your cloak around you and lean back against a sack of grain. The fires are beginning to burn down to glowing embers, watched over by the sentries. Tomorrow, you will pack up this entire city and move it another 20 miles, only to rebuild it again before dusk. It is a grueling, endless cycle, but as long as the kazan is hauled forward, the empire moves with it. You close your eyes, the warmth of the hearth still radiating through your boots. The wilderness is vast and hostile, but as long as the fire is lit and the pot is full, you are never truly lost. You are standing in the expansive second courtyard of the Topkapi Palace, and the air is vibrating with the sound of thousands of boots coming to a synchronized halt. It is a Friday, the day of the Divani Humayun, and you are about to participate in the Pilaf oath. This is the most important meal of your life, recurring every 3 months. Before you, hundreds of immense wooden trays are being carried out from the imperial kitchens by a small army of servants. On these trays sits a mountain of white rice, glistening with clarified butter and dotted with currants and pine nuts. This isn't just lunch, it is a legal contract. You probably wouldn't survive the tension of this moment, as every eye from the Sultan's grilled window is watching to see if you reach for your spoon or leave your hands at your sides. The mainstream historical fact is that the Friday palace meal was the ultimate barometer of the state's health. If the Janissaries accepted and ate the Sultan's pilaf, it was a public declaration of their continued allegiance and satisfaction with their pay. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The palace cooks were under such immense pressure during this meal that if the rice was even slightly scorched, it could be interpreted as an intentional insult to the troops, potentially sparking a riot. You aren't just a diner, you are a food critic with the power to topple a dynasty. You sniff the air, looking for that perfect balance of spice and steam that says all is well in the House of Osman. Historians still argue whether the Pilaf oath was a genuine tradition of mutual respect or a hollow piece of theater that both the Sultan and the Janissaries used to mask a relationship built on mutual fear. For you, the theater is very real. You look at your brothers in the Uta. Everyone is perfectly still. The silence in the courtyard is so profound, you can hear the flapping of the pigeons on the palace roof. Then, the signal is given. Your Korbak soup maker steps forward, takes a mouthful of the rice, and nods. Only then do you and the thousands of men behind you descend upon the trays with a disciplined, rhythmic efficiency. There is a gentle sarcasm in the way the veteran next to you whispers, "Eat up, boy. The Sultan's treasury is feeling heavy today, and he's turned it into carbs." You smile behind your mustache. The rice is perfect fluffy, rich, and fragrant. This is the bread and salt bond in its highest form. By consuming the Sultan's food within his own walls, you are renewing your vow to be his sword and shield. It's a biological "I agree to the terms and conditions of being an elite soldier." You realize that as long as this rice is served and eaten, the gates of Istanbul will remain closed to any invader. The logistics of this single meal are a feat of strength. The palace kitchens, with their iconic conical chimneys designed by the great architect Sinan, have been working since before dawn. Historians note that for a single Friday session, the kitchens might process over 1,000 sheep and enough rice to fill a small ship. You see the Akskabak head cook standing at the edge of the courtyard, watching the men eat. He looks like a general who has just won a battle. In a way, he has successfully fed the hungry lions and kept the peace for another quarter. However, there is an open scholarly debate phrase that haunts this ceremony. Historians still argue whether the transition from soldiers to palace guests eventually robbed the Janissaries of their martial edge. You feel the luxury of the setting the marble, the silk banners, the exquisite food, and you can see how a man might grow too fond of the Sultan's kitchen. But then you feel the weight of the dagger at your belt and the spoon in your cap. The spoon reminds you that you are a servant. The dagger reminds you that you are a master. You are the Janissary, the paradox of the Ottoman world. A slave who eats like a king and a warrior who defines himself by a pot of soup. As you finish your portion, you wipe your mustache and stand back at attention. The trays are cleared away with the same speed they appeared. The oath is complete. The Sultan can breathe a sigh of relief in his private quarters, and the Grand Vizier can proceed with the business of the empire. You feel the energy of the meal coursing through you. You are fed, you are paid, and you are loyal. For now, you march out of the courtyard, the sun glinting off the copper handles of the cauldrons being carried back to the barracks. You return to your quarters, the taste of the saffron still lingering on your tongue. It was a good day. The pilaf was buttery, the meat was tender, and the oath was kept. You tuck your spoon deeper into your felt cap, a silent acknowledgement of the bond you just renewed. The palace is a place of many secrets, but the simplest truth of the empire is found in the courtyard. A full Janissary is a quiet Janissary. You lay down on your mat, the soft background hum of the city lulling you to sleep. Knowing that the hearth has been honored once again, the golden warmth of the palace courtyard is a distant memory now as you trudge through the knee-deep mud of a Hungarian autumn. The luxury of buttery saffron rice has been replaced by the grim reality of the long march. You are cold, your boots are leaking, and the supply wagons are struggling to keep pace with the vanguard. In moments like these, the Janissary doesn't look for a feast, he looks for the peksimet. This twice-baked hardtack is the true foundation of the empire. It is a stone-hard biscuit, brown and unassuming, but it contains enough caloric density to keep a man marching for 20 miles a day. You probably wouldn't survive a meal of this today without a very expensive dentist on standby, as biting into a dry peksimet is less like eating bread and more like chewing on a roof tile. The mainstream historical fact is that the Ottoman military's ability to campaign over vast distances was largely due to this standardized, mass-produced biscuit. While European armies often relied on local grain that might be rotten or non-existent, the Ottomans had a centralized state biscuit strategy. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The quality of the peksimet was so strictly regulated that samples from every batch were sent to the palace to be tasted by officials. If a baker was found to be cutting the flour with sawdust or sand, they weren't just fired, they were often nailed to their own shop door by their ears. You aren't just eating a biscuit, you are eating the product of a very violent quality control department. Historians still argue whether the transition to a diet dominated by hardtack during long campaigns led to a significant drop in troop morale, or if the Janissaries viewed the hard bread as a badge of their toughness. For you, leaning against a damp tree as the rain drips off your felt cap, the peksimet is a test of patience. You don't just bite it, you have to strategize. You soak it in a canteen of water, or if you're lucky, a bit of thin mutton broth until it softens into a grainy mush. It isn't delicious, but as the calories hit your bloodstream, you feel the strength returning to your legs. There is a gentle sarcasm in the way you look at the soggy biscuit. "Ah, the Sultan's finest granite," you mutter to your tent mate. "I can tell if I'm getting stronger, or if my teeth are just getting shorter." The stakes of the peksimet were incredibly high. If the biscuit supply failed, the army stopped. You remember passing through a village where the local ovens had been seized by the state for 3 months straight to bake for the passing corps. The villagers were compensated, but the message was clear. The Janissary stomach comes first. This logistical ruthlessness is what allowed you to strike deep into the heart of Europe while your enemies were still waiting for their harvests. You are a part of a military machine that treats flour like gunpowder and ovens like artillery. There is an open scholarly debate phrase that often comes up when discussing these long-distance campaigns. Historians still argue whether the logistical weight of the biscuit supply eventually became the invisible ceiling of Ottoman expansion. Every mile you march away from the central granaries, the cost of the peksimet increases. Eventually, the camels eat more than they carry. But tonight, you aren't worried about the macroeconomics of the 17th century. You are worried about the rock in your hand. You manage to soften a piece and swallow it, feeling the familiar, heavy warmth in your belly. It is honest, brutal food for an honest, brutal life. You see the Axkabak head cook walking through the mud, checking on the men. He isn't carrying a ladle tonight, he's carrying a ledger. He's counting crates, ensuring that no one is hoarding more than their share. Even in the middle of a swamp, the hierarchy of the kitchen remains. He gives you a nod, a silent acknowledgement of your endurance. You realize that the peksimet is more than just food. It's a symbol of the Sultan's reach. No matter how far you go, no matter how cold it gets, he has provided this hard, dry promise of survival. As the camp settles into a shivering, damp silence, you wrap your remaining biscuits in a piece of oiled cloth to keep them from turning into a soggy mess. You look at your musket, then at your bread bag. In the morning, you will need both to survive. The hardtack and high stakes of the march are the price of being the elite. You are a Janissary, and while the generals plan the maneuvers, it is the biscuit that decides if you'll be alive to execute them. You drift into a light sleep. The taste of dry wheat on your tongue and the sound of the rain against the canvas of the tent reminding you that the road to glory is paved with very, very hard bread. The dust of the march has coated your throat in a layer of fine, choking grit, and for the last 5 miles, you've thought of nothing but the cool, clear weight of a cup of water. In the parched landscape of the Anatolian interior, or the salt-cracked plains of the east, the Sultan's gold means nothing if your tongue is swollen and your canteen is dry. This is where the Soka Corps, the water-bearers, become the most important men in the empire. You see them now, they're sturdy ponies laden with bulging leather skins that sweat in the heat, creating a tantalizing humid aura around them. You probably wouldn't survive a single day as a Soka. They are the lowest-ranking Janissaries, yet they carry the heaviest burden. Marching through the thickest of the fight, not with shields, but with the lifeblood of the army. The mainstream historical fact is that the Ottoman military was the first to recognize water purification and supply as a dedicated military branch. While Western armies were often decimated by dysentery from drinking standing pond water, the Soka were tasked with finding fresh springs, protecting them from enemy poisoners, and transporting the water in specialized skins treated with resin. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The Soka had a secret network of information. Because they were constantly moving between the front lines, the kitchens, and the local villages to find wells. They were the army's primary gossip mongers and unofficial intelligence agents. You aren't just getting a drink, you re-getting the latest word on whether the Grand Vizier is in a foul mood or if the Sultan has actually run out of coffee. Historians still argue whether the Soka's unique position, being unarmed yet essential, created a specific subculture of protected status that allowed them to move through battlefields where others would be cut down. To you, watching them navigate the chaotic camp, they seem like ghosts of the hearth. They are the only ones who can walk into any orda and be greeted with a smile rather than a challenge. You see a Soka approach your unit now, yes, wearing a leather vest that has been polished by the friction of the water bags until it glows like armor. There is a gentle sarcasm in how you greet him. "Welcome, O Prince of the Clouds. I hope you haven't brought us a bag of Balkan mud today," he just grunts, pouring a steady silver stream into your cup. The secret network of the water-bearers extended even to the palace, because the Soka supplied the imperial kitchens. They were one of the few groups that had a legitimate reason to be near the Sultan's private quarters at odd hours. This made them perfect conduits for messages that did UNX want to be seen by the official eunuchs or guards. You realize that the very water you are drinking has passed through a dozen hands that might be shaping the fate of the empire. It's a sobering thought, but when the water hits the back of your throat, all you care about is the sheer cold relief of it. There is an open scholarly debate phrase that frequently appears in studies of Ottoman endurance. Historians still argue whether the Ottomans' superior water discipline was the primary factor in their ability to besiege fortresses for months longer than their European counterparts. You've seen it happen. You've seen the defenders of a Hungarian fort drinking their own wine until they were delirious with thirst, while you and your brothers had a steady, regulated supply of water filtered through charcoal. It isn't just about survival. It's about the mental edge of knowing you aren't going to rot from the inside out before the breach is made. You watch the Soka move on to the next fire, his pony's bells tinkling in the twilight. He is the unsung hero of the kitchen hierarchy. Without him, the kazan is just an empty pot, and the peksiment is a stone that can't be swallowed. You feel a sudden surge of respect for the man. He doesn't get the glory of the cavalry charge or the prestige of the soup maker, but he holds the thread of your life in his leather bags. You take one last sip, savoring the metallic temps of the water skin, and feel your strength returning. The night air begins to cool, and the water-bearer's secret network starts to hum with the news of the evening. Rumor has it that a fresh spring was found 3 miles ahead, which means the march tomorrow will be easier. You lean back against your pack, the dampness of your throat the only thing keeping the exhaustion at bay. In the Ottoman world, power flows from the Sultan, but life flows from the Soka. You are a Janissary, a man of the hearth, and tonight, thanks to the humble water-bearer, your hearth has the one ingredient that turns a desert into a home. You are crouched in a zigzag trench just outside the crumbling walls of a Venetian-held fortress on the coast of the Morea. It is the dead of night, and the only light comes from the slow-burning matches of your fellow musketeers. But while the defenders are staring into the darkness, bracing for an assault that hasn't come, you are inhaling a scent that seems entirely out of place in a war zone. The rich, heady aroma of saffron, cumin, and roasting fat. The Ottoman camp is less than half a mile away, and the wind is blowing directly toward the starving garrison. This is culinary psychological warfare. You probably wouldn't survive the mental strain of being on the other side of those walls, smelling a 5-course meal while you're reduced to eating boiled shoe leather and sawdust. The mainstream historical fact is that Ottoman siege warfare was as much about logistical intimidation as it was about cannons. The Janissaries didn't just dig trenches, they established fully functional markets and kitchens that operated with the regularity of a clock. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The Janissaries would sometimes deliberately throw fresh bread or fruit over the enemy walls during a lull in the fighting. It wasn't an act of charity. It was a devastating flex to show that, while the defenders were rotting away, the Sultan's army was living in absolute luxury. You aren't just a soldier, you are a participant in a grand edible taunt. Historians still argue whether the scent of spices like cinnamon and cloves in a military camp was a deliberate tactic to mask the smell of death and disease, or a sincere attempt to keep the elite Janissaries from feeling the homesickness of the hearth. For you, sitting in the damp earth, the spices are a reminder of your status. You look back toward the campfires, where the axkabak is likely supervising a batch of spiced lamb pilaf. The smell is a weapon. You can almost feel the morale of the defenders snapping like a dry twig as they realize that for the Ottomans, this siege isn't a desperate struggle, it's just another Tuesday at the office, complete with a hot lunch. There is a gentle sarcasm in the way you discuss the starving infidels with your sergeant. "I wonder if they can smell the saffron tonight," he whispers, a cruel glint in his eye. "Maybe we should send them a recipe, so they have something to read while their stomachs growl." It's a joke that only a Welfed man could make. You realize that your superiority on the battlefield is inextricably linked to the Silk Road spices in your ration bag. While the European supply lines are often a chaotic mess of moldy grain and vinegar, your supply lines are a highway of flavor and prestige. The spices and silk aspect of your life also serves a biological purpose. Saffron and cumin weren't just for taste. They were known to aid digestion and keep the men alert. In the high-stakes environment of a siege, where a single lapse in concentration could lead to a deadly sortie by the enemy, a bowl of spiced lentils is better than a shot of brandy. You feel the warmth of the spices in your chest, a slow-burning fuel that keeps the damp cold of the trench at bay. You are part of an army that treats its palate as seriously as its powder. An open scholarly debate phrase often surfaces when discussing these long sieges. Historians still argue whether the Janissaries' culinary comforts actually slowed down their conquests by making them unwilling to leave the luxury of the camp for the hardships of a final assault. You find this idea amusing. You aren't slow because you're lazy. You're slow because you're inevitable. Why rush into a hail of bullets when you can sit back, eat your spiced mutton, and wait for the enemy to simply give up because they couldn't bear the smell of your dinner anymore? As the first light of dawn begins to gray the sky, the campfires are stoked for breakfast. The scent of fresh coffee begins to mingle with the lingering aroma of the night's stew. You look at the fortress walls, silent and grim. You know that inside the men are checking their empty grain bins. You take a piece of spiced dried fruit from your pouch and chew it slowly. The spices, silk, and siege warfare strategy is working. The empire doesn't just conquer with the sword, it conquers with the spoon. And tonight, the spoon is winning. You are standing on the high banks of the Maritsa River, and as far as your eyes can see, the landscape is a moving sea of wool and dust. It is the spring of 1526, and the Sultan is marching toward the plains of Mohammed. You aren't looking at a column of soldiers, but at the great mutton logistics, a literal tidal wave of millions of sheep being driven across the empire to ensure that your hearth never goes cold. In any other army, the livestock would be a chaotic mess. But here, the sheep are organized with the same discipline as the infantry. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer noise of this journey, a cacophony of bleating and shouting that drowns out the very sound of the drums. The mainstream historical fact is that the Ottoman military machine was supported by a massive state-mandated livestock drive that involved thousands of professional drovers. For the 1526 campaign alone, records suggest that over 100,000 sheep were moved specifically for the Janissary Corps. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The sheep were actually color-coded using vegetable dyes on their wool to indicate which regiment or orta they belonged to. You aren't just looking at a flock, you're looking at a mobile edible filing system. You see a group of sheep with blue-skinned shoulders, and you know that, tomorrow, dinner for the 64th Regiment. Historians still argue whether this massive reliance on live meat was a strategic masterstroke that kept the troops healthy, or a logistical nightmare that slowed the army's pace to a crawl. For you, the answer is found in the quality of your strength. While the Hungarian knights you are about to face are likely surviving on salted pork that's been in a barrel since last winter, you are eating fresh protein every single day. You see the kasep, the specialized army butchers, moving through the flocks with their sharp, curved knives. They are as much a part of the vanguard as the archers. There is a gentle sarcasm in the way you watch the drovers struggle with a stubborn ram. Look at him, your friend laughs. He's fighting harder than a Venetian mercenary. He knows he's destined for the Sultan's pilaf. It's a joke that masks the reality of the scale. This isn't just a meal, it's the physical manifestation of the Sultan's power. To move millions of animals across 3 continents requires a level of bureaucratic precision that the rest of the world won't achieve for centuries. You realize that for every Janissary with a musket, there are 3 sheep following him into battle. The mutton logistics also served a psychological purpose. When you march into a newly conquered territory, the sight of an endless supply of food following the army is a terrifying sign of permanence. It tells the locals that you aren't here to raid and leave. You've brought your entire ecosystem with you. You see the Axkabek head cook consulting with the chief drover, checking the health of the animals. If the sheep are thin, the army's morale will be thin. The great mutton logistics of 1526 are the reason why. When you finally meet the enemy on the field, you will be faster, stronger, and more resilient. An open scholarly debate phrase often used by economic historians is historians still argue whether the exhaustion of the empire's livestock reserves during these great campaigns was the hidden trigger for the Ottoman economic crises of the late 16th century. You, however, only care about the sizzle of the fat over the fire tonight. The supply is holding, the grass in the Balkans is lush, and the Sultan's bounty is walking right behind you. You feel a sense of absolute security. You are the predator at the top of a very large, very well-organized food chain. As the evening settles, the drovers pen the sheep in a massive circle around the camp. The sound of the bleating becomes a rhythmic background hum, a strange lullaby for a warrior. You sit by your kazan watching the butcher deliver the evening's portion. The meat is fresh, red, and rich. You tuck your spoon into your cap and prepare for the feast. The generals may have the maps, but the sheep have the momentum. Tomorrow, you will march again, and the sea of wool will follow, ensuring that the Janissary heart remains as full as its stomach. The night air in the encampment is cool and crisp, but your senses are sharp, alert, and oddly electrified. While the rest of the world sleeps in the heavy, sluggish embrace of ale or wine, you are holding a small, handleless ceramic cup filled with a thick, midnight black liquid that smells of burnt earth and hidden energy. This is the black pulse of the Corps coffee. It has only recently become a staple of your life, migrating from the Sufi lodges of Yemen to the heart of the Janissary barracks. And it has fundamentally changed how you experience the war. You probably wouldn't survive your first Janissary double shot without a heart palpitation, as this brew is strong enough to dissolve a silver coin and thick enough to be eaten with a spoon. The mainstream historical fact is that the Ottoman Empire was the gateway for coffee into Europe, and the Janissaries were its most enthusiastic early adopters. They didn't just drink it for the taste. They used it as a functional military drug to sustain long watches and overnight marches. But here's a quirky, fringe tidbit. Coffee was initially so controversial that some conservative clerics tried to ban it, calling it the black enemy of sleep. The Janissaries, however, essentially bullied the state into legalizing it by threatening to overturn their cauldrons if their coffee rations were interfered with. You aren't just a coffee drinker. You are part of the reason the global coffee shop culture exists today. Historians still argue whether the introduction of caffeine into the Janissary ranks contributed to their increasing political volatility by keeping them awake, caffeinated, and prone to late-night conspiracying in the barracks. For you, sitting by a low fire, the pulse is purely practical. It clears the fog from your brain better than any prayer or cold splash of water. You watch the kvechi, the dedicated coffee maker of your orta, as he nestles the long-handled copper sesve into the hot sands of the hearth. He is a master of timing, waiting for the foam to rise 3 times before pouring. There is a gentle sarcasm in how you watch the new recruits try to drink it too fast, only to end up coughing on the fine grounds at the bottom. It's a drink, not a race. Boy, you chuckle. Save that energy for the trenches. the coffeehouse culture of Istanbul has followed you to the front lines. Even in the middle of a campaign, the coffee man is a permanent fixture of the logistics train. This isn't just about the caffeine, it's about the sohbet, the social bonding that happens over the cup. In the quiet hours of the night watch, the coffeehouse becomes the nerve center of the regiment. You discuss tactics, you share rumors from the palace, and you solidify the bonds of the okak. You realize that the sultan might provide the meat and the bread, but the coffee provides the spirit. It is the wine of Islam, the sober intoxication that keeps the Ottoman machine running while the enemy is hungover or asleep. There is an open scholarly debate phrase that often appears in cultural histories. Historians still argue whether the Janissary coffeehouse was the first true public sphere where common soldiers could debate the policies of the sultan without fear of immediate reprisal. You feel that freedom tonight, in the dim light of the embers, with the scent of roasted beans masking the smell of the damp earth. You feel like more than just a cog in the machine. You are a thinker, a watcher, and a warrior. The coffee has sharpened your edges, making you a more dangerous sentry and a more opinionated citizen. You take a slow sip, letting the bitter, intense heat settle in your chest. The world seems to come into high definition. You can hear the distant clatter of the Soka's ponies and the soft rustle of the wind in the banners. The black pulse is doing its work. Tomorrow will be a day of exertion and blood, but tonight you are the master of the dark. You look at your spoon in your cap, then at the cup in your hand. One feeds the body, the other feeds the mind. As the moon reaches its zenith, you finish the last of the brew, leaving a thick layer of sediment at the bottom of the cup, the mud of the soul. You feel ready for anything the night might throw at you. The coffee has bridged the gap between the exhaustion of the march and the requirements of the watch. You are a Janissary, and while your enemies dream of home, you are wide awake. Fueled by the black gold of the East, the pulse of the corps is steady, strong, and very, very calm. You are standing on a ridge overlooking a valley in central Germany during the height of the 30 Years' War. To your left, your fellow Janissaries are finishing a meal of boiled beef and warm bread. Their gear neatly stacked, their horses groomed and fed. Below you, however, lies the camp of a European mercenary company, and it looks like a vision of the apocalypse. The men down there are gaunt, their ribs pressing against skin like the hulls of wrecked ships. They are currently fighting over a dead dog, their camp a chaotic mire of filth and disease. You probably wouldn't survive 10 minutes in that camp, not because of the soldiers, but because the air itself is thick with the scent of starvation and desperation. This is the Great Divide, the Janissary versus the starving mercenary. The mainstream historical fact is that the Ottoman military's logistical superiority meant that their casualty rates from disease and malnutrition were significantly lower than those of contemporary European armies. While the West relied on contributions, a polite word for looting local peasants until they died of famine, the Ottomans brought a standardized, state-funded ration system to the field. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. European observers were often so baffled by the Janissaries' health that they believed the Ottoman army possessed alchemical secrets to preserve food, or that the heathen diet of yogurt and dried fruit was a form of dark magic. You aren't a sorcerer. You read just a soldier whose boss understands that a hungry man can hold a pike. Historians still argue whether the Janissary standardized diet gave them a psychological advantage that was even greater than their physical one. For you, the advantage is clear as you watch a mercenary below try to chew on a piece of leather. You have the covenant of the salt. You know exactly when your next meal is coming. This certainty allows you to focus on your drill, your aim, and your loyalty. There is a gentle sarcasm in the way you look at the mercenaries' chaos. Look at them, you whisper to your comrade. They fight for a coin they can spend because there's no bread left to buy. We fight because the Sultan has already paid us in lamb. Image comparing a clean Janissary mess kit with the scavenged rags of a 17th century European mercenary. There is an open scholarly debate phrase that often surfaces when comparing these two military worlds. Historians still argue whether the lack of a centralized supply system in Europe was a deliberate choice to keep armies small and mobile, or a catastrophic failure of statecraft. You don't care about the statecraft, you care about the contrast. You see the ekmekabaki chief baker delivering a fresh batch of bread to your orta. It is white, fluffy, and smells of heaven. Below you, the mercenaries are eating starvation bread made of ground acorns and sawdust. The difference between victory and defeat is often just a matter of fiber and protein. This logistical gap also dictated how you treated the land. Because you were fed by the Sultan, you didn't need to burn every village you passed. You were a disciplined guest, whereas the mercenary was a plague of locusts. You realize that your culinary elite status makes you a more effective tool of empire. You can occupy a territory without destroying its future tax base, simply because you brought your own dinner. The Janissary versus the starving mercenary is the story of a professional machine versus a desperate mob. As the sun sets, the contrast becomes even more vivid. Your camp is a grid of orderly fires and rising steam. The mercenary camp is a dark, cold pit of groans and silent shadows. You take a bite of your ration, the savory juices of the meat, a testament to your value. You are the Sultan's investment, and he protects his assets. The European kings, however, seem to treat their men like firewood, to be burned and discarded. You feel a rare moment of pity for the men in the valley, but it's quickly replaced by the pride of the hearth. You tuck your spoon into your cap, the wood smooth against your forehead. Tomorrow, when the trumpets sound, you will be the one with the energy to charge. You are a Janissary, and your strength is built on the foundation of the imperial kitchen. While the world starves in the name of glory, you march toward glory with a full stomach. The Janissary versus the starving mercenary isn't a fair fight. It's a slaughter fueled by the difference between a moldy acorn and a piece of prime mutton. You are standing in the center of the camp as the sun begins to dip below the horizon. And while the combat colonel is busy inspecting the condition of the muskets, every soldier's eye is actually tracking the movement of the aşçi-başi head cook in the Janissary Corps. The man with the ladle often carries more tactical weight than the man with the map. You see him now, a broad-shouldered veteran whose apron is as much a part of his identity as his armor. He isn't just boiling water, he is reading the mood of the regiment. If the men are skittish before a battle, he might add a bit of extra honey to the morning porridge. If they are growing arrogant, he might pull back on the spices to ground them. He probably wouldn't survive the mental gymnastics of his job, where one bad batch of stew could literally trigger a military coup before the enemy even fires a shot. The mainstream historical fact is that the aşçi-başi was one of the most senior and influential officers within a Janissary orta. He sat on the regimental council and had a direct line to the Sultan's advisors. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The head cook was also the unofficial judge of the hearth. If two soldiers had a dispute that didn't warrant a court-martial, they were often brought before the aşçi-başi. He would settle the matter while stirring a pot. And his word was final because he controlled the most powerful leverage in the world, your place at the table. You aren't just looking at a chef. You're looking at a tactical psychologist who uses calories to maintain the chain of command. Historians still argue whether the aşçi-başi's influence was a stabilizing force that prevented unnecessary bloodshed or a dangerous shadow power that undermined the authority of the actual military commanders. From your perspective, sitting by the fire, the answer is irrelevant. You know that if the soup maker is happy, the camp is a well-oiled machine. You watch him approach the Korbach, the unit commander. They speak in low tones, their heads together. The commander is asking about the state of the grain, but what he's really asking is, are the men ready to die for me tomorrow? The aşçi-başi tastes a spoonful of the evening broth, pauses, and gives a short, sharp nod. The chef, as a tactical advisor, has just given the green light for the morning's assault. There is a gentle sarcasm in the way the veterans treat the aşçi-başi. They call him the Lord of the Ladle, but they do it with a reverence that borders on the religious. Don't cross the cook, your sergeant warns, or you'll find your portion is all chickpeas and no lamb for the rest of the campaign. It's a joke, but you've seen it happen. The kitchen is a place of discipline, and the aşçi-başi is its high priest. He understands that morale isn't built on speeches. It's built on the steady, reliable rhythm of the hearth. While the generals talk about glory and destiny, the cook talks about sustenance and salt. You realize that the head cook is also a master of environmental intelligence. He knows which local water sources are safe, which woods burn the hottest, and which local villages have the best hidden stores of forage. In many ways, he is the army's most effective scout. He moves through the camp like a ghost of the stove, his presence a constant reminder that the Sultan's bounty is never far away. There is an open scholarly debate phrase that captures this perfectly. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman kitchen cabinet was the secret reason for their incredible siege endurance, compared to the fractured command structures of Europe. As the evening meal is served, you watch the aşçi-başi stand back and observe. He doesn't eat until everyone else is served. He is the guardian of the salt covenant. You feel a sense of profound security knowing he is there. The generals might lead you into a trap, but the cook will make sure you have the energy to fight your way out of it. He is the unsung architect of your victories, the man who turns raw ingredients into the fuel of conquest. You take your bowl, the warmth of the stew seeping into your hands, and offer a silent thanks to the man with the ladle. The camp settles into a quiet hum of satisfaction. The tactical advisor has done his job once again. The men are fed, the fires are controlled, and the morale of the orta is as solid as the kazan itself. You tuck your spoon into your cap, feeling the weight of the day's march lift from your shoulders. Tomorrow, you will follow the banners into the smoke of battle, but tonight, you are at peace. The kitchen is the heart of the army, and as long as the askabak is watching the fire, you know the empire is in safe hands. You are marching through the winding cobblestone streets of Istanbul. But today, your musket is slung low and your stride is light. The heavy air of the barracks has been replaced by the festive, sugary scent of honey, rosewater, and toasted nuts. It is the end of Ramadan, and you are part of the legendary baklava procession. This is the moment when the Sultan's gratitude takes a physical, flaky form. From the palace kitchens, hundreds of trays of the finest baklavates. One, a masterpiece of 40 layers of phyllo. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer sugar rush of this event, especially since you re-expected to maintain military posture while staring at enough honey to drown a cavalry horse. The mainstream historical fact is that the baklava procession, or baklava alay, was a formal state ceremony held on the 15th day of Ramadan. It was a public display of the bond between the Sultan and his Janissaries. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The procession was also a high-stakes race. Once the trays were delivered to the barracks, the soldiers would compete to see which orta could finish their trays the fastest, often leading to pastry-induced brawls that required the intervention of the soup maker. You aren't just a soldier. You are a participant in the world's most elite desert buffet. You watch the sun glint off the silver trays as they pass, your mouth watering at the thought of the butter-soaked layers waiting at the end of the march. Historians still argue whether the baklava procession was a genuine gesture of royal affection or a calculated bribe to keep the Janissaries sweet, literally during the holy month, when tensions often ran high. For you, the politics are secondary to the taste. You see the crowds of Istanbul lining the streets, cheering as the elite of the empire march past, followed by the sweet artillery of the palace bakers. There is a gentle sarcasm in the way the city folk watch you. Look at the fierce lions, one might whisper, reduced to kittens by a bit of sugar and nuts. You don't mind. You know that tomorrow you might be back in the trenches. But today, the world is made of honey. The sweet victory of the procession is a reminder of the Sultan's incredible wealth. Baklava wasn't a commoner's snack. The sheer amount of sugar and expensive nuts required for thousands of soldiers was a display of imperial surplus. You realize that your status as a son of the Sultan comes with perks that even the wealthiest merchants in Europe would envy. While the peasants in the countryside are breaking their fast with dates and water, you are being served a delicacy fit for a vizier. It is a sugary reinforcement of your place at the top of the social hierarchy. There is an open, scholarly debate phrase that often pops up in cultural studies of the Ottoman court. Historians still argue whether these public displays of culinary largesse actually weakened the Janissaries by domesticating them and making them more interested in palace politics than frontier warfare. You feel the truth of this as you reach the barracks, and the trays are set down. The discipline of the march breaks into a joyous, chaotic scramble. You grab a piece, the syrup sticking to your mustache, and for a moment, the grueling marches and the cold nights of the Balkan winter are forgotten. This is the baklava bond, a tradition that says, you protect the throne, and the throne will provide the sweetness. As the sun sets, and the call to prayer echoes from the Hagia Sophia, the feast begins in earnest. The baklava procession has done its job. The morale of the corps is at an all-time high, and the city is at peace. You sit with your brothers, sharing the bounty, the layers of pastry crunching between your teeth. You look at your spoon in your cap and think about how it has tasted both the hardtack of the march and the honey of the palace. You are a Janissary, a man of extremes, and tonight you are basking in the sweetest victory of all. The sweet, lingering taste of the Ramadan baklava has begun to turn bitter in your mouth as the air in the barracks is now thick with a different kind of heat, the heat of suspicion. You are standing in the corner of the mess hall, watching a group of palace officials in stiff, European-style tunics walk through the courtyard. They aren't here to inspect the quality of the mutton. They are here to modernize your life. They carry clipboards and talk of Nizami Sedid, a new order, for the first time in centuries. The Sultan is suggesting that your traditional culinary titles and the sacred autonomy of the kitchen are obstacles to progress. You probably wouldn't survive the internal conflict of this moment, as you re-force to choose between the ancient Salt Covenant and a future that looks increasingly like a foreign import. The mainstream historical fact is that by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Janissary Corps had become a bloated, politically dominant force that resisted any military reform that threatened their hereditary privileges. The poisoned chalice of reform refers to the various attempts by sultans like Selim III to create a new Western-style army alongside the Janissaries. But here's a quirky, fringe tidbit. The Janissaries were so offended by the new army's uniforms, specifically the lack of a place to hold a soup spoon, that they viewed the new troops not just as rivals, but as un-Islamic and soulless. You aren't just defending your pay, you are defending the very architecture of your identity, which is built into the handle of a ladle. Historians still argue whether the Janissaries' resistance to reform was a legitimate defense of a functional social contract or a selfish, reactionary refusal to adapt that doomed the empire to decline. For you, leaning against the blackened stone of the hearth, it feels like a betrayal. You see the new order soldiers practicing drills in the distance. They don't have korbaks, soup makers. They have captains. They don't gather around a communal kazan. They eat from individual tin plates like prisoners. There is a gentle sarcasm in how you describe them to your brothers. Look at the Sultaness' new toys. They march like clockwork, but I bet their soup tastes like the dust they kick up. It's a joke, but the laughter in the barracks is hollow. The tension is a slow simmering stew. Every time the Sultan suggests a new training manual or a change in the way the grain is distributed, a ripple of silent fury moves through the okak. You realize that the kitchen is no longer just a place of nourishment, it is a bunker. The poisoned chalice is the realization that the world is changing, and the Ottoman hearth, which once warmed the heart of the world, is being viewed as an old, smoky relic. You feel the weight of the Salt Covenant pulling at you. If you accept the new ways, are you still a Janissary? Or are you just a man in a uniform waiting for a meal that has no meaning? There is an open scholarly debate phrase that often defines this era. Historians still argue whether the Janissary as culinary conservatism was the primary anchor that prevented the Ottoman Empire from participating in the Industrial Revolution. You don't know about industry, but you know about tradition. You know that when the Sultaness reformers tried to replace the traditional butchers with state-contracted suppliers to save money, the Janissaries didn't just protest, they occupied the slaughterhouses. It wasn't about the money, it was about the control. The kitchen is the last bastion of your power, and you will not see it modernized into a cold, efficient ledger. As the night falls, the mood in the barracks is grim. The Axkabak head cook is stirring the pot with more force than usual, the metal clanging against the copper like a warning. The reformers are still in the palace, whispering into the Sultan's ear about efficiency and tactic. You look at the kazan, the symbol of your brotherhood, and you see the flickering reflection of a world that is passing you by. You tuck your spoon into your cap, but it feels like a heavy burden tonight. The poisoned chalice of reform has been offered, and you know that whether you drink it or shatter it, nothing will ever be the same again. The night air of Istanbul is thick with the smell of charred wood and wet ash, a sharp, acrid contrast to the usual evening scent of roasting meat. You are standing in the middle of a narrow street in Galata, the European quarter of the city. But you aren't here to patrol for criminals. You are part of a wall of fire. In your hand, you hold a massive kitchen torch, its flame licking the overhanging wooden balconies of the merchant houses. This is how the Janissaries communicate when the Sultan stops listening. You set the city ablaze. You probably wouldn't survive the intense heat and the falling debris of these man-made infernos, which could swallow entire districts in hours, turning the majestic skyline of Istanbul into a jagged silhouette of orange and black. The mainstream historical fact is that the Janissaries, who were officially the city's firefighters, often used their specialized equipment, the very tools they used to manage the barracks. Massive hearths to commit arson as a form of political leverage. If the guests were unhappy, they made sure the host felt the heat. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The Janissaries had a specialized They would sometimes wait by a burning building and refuse to pump a single drop of water until the owner paid a donation to the regiment's kitchen fund. You aren't just a soldier. You are an armed extortionist with a bucket and a ladder. Historians still argue whether the Janissary fires were chaotic outbursts of frustrated men or a highly organized surgical method of property destruction designed to target specific political rivals within the city. For you, standing in the flickering orange light, it feels like the only way to be seen. The palace reformers are trying to starve your influence, but they can't ignore a fire that is creeping toward the walls of the Topkapi. There is a gentle sarcasm in the way you watch the New Order soldiers trying to organize a bucket brigade. Look at them. You sneer to your comrade. They can't even handle a little spark. Maybe we should show them how a real hearthman handles a flame. This fire in the streets is a perversion of your original role. The hearth was meant to be a place of life and nourishment, but in your hands, it has become a weapon of terror. You realize that the relationship between the Janissaries and the city of Istanbul has become parasitic. You are the protectors who have become the predators. As the timber of a warehouse groans and collapses, sending a geyser of sparks into the night sky, you feel a sense of grim satisfaction. The Sultan will see this. The Grand Vizier will smell the smoke in his silk sheets. They will realize that you still control the temperature of the empire. There is an open scholarly debate phrase that often defines this era of urban unrest. Historians still argue whether the Janissaries' role as both firefighters and arsonists was the ultimate expression of their dual-state power within the Ottoman capital. You don't care about the duality, you care about the result. By the time the sun rises, the Sultan will likely have issued a decree, reversing the latest meat tax or dismissing the reformist advisor you loathe. The kitchen torches have spoken louder than any petition ever could. You are the masters of the fire, whether it's under a soup pot or under the city's foundations. As the fires begin to smolder and the gray light of dawn reveals the blackened skeletons of the Galata district, you and your brothers retreat to the barracks. You are covered in soot, your lungs burning, but your bellies will be full tomorrow. You look at the torch in your hand, now extinguished and cold. It is a simple tool, yet it has the power to reshape the map of the capital. You tuck your spoon into your cap, but it feels out of place against your soot-stained uniform. You have moved from the kitchen to the streets, and the hearth has become a pyre. The city of Istanbul remains on edge, a tattered tapestry of ash and stone. You know that this isn't the last time the kitchen torches will be lit. As long as the Sultan tries to change the rules of the Salt Covenant, the city will pay the price in smoke. You lay down on your mat, the smell of fire still clinging to your skin, knowing that you have reminded the world who truly guards the fire of the Ottoman house. The empire is burning, and you are the ones holding the match. You are standing in a makeshift paddock on the edge of the campaign camp, and the sound surrounding you isn't the familiar rhythm of the march, but the wet, heavy thud of a cleaver meeting bone. This is the realm of the Kasab, the specialized guild of butchers, who are as essential to your survival as the men who manufacture your gunpowder. You watch one of them now? He is a man of immense forearms and blood-spattered leather, moving with a clinical, terrifying speed that would make a surgeon envious. He is currently processing a line of Anatolian sheep, transforming live animals into the precise cuts of mutton required for your unit's evening stew. You probably wouldn't survive the shadow of the butcher for very long. Not because of the gore, but because of the sheer physical endurance required to butcher enough meat for 60,000 men before the sun reaches its zenith. The mainstream historical fact is that the Ottoman military butcher was a legally recognized and highly regulated member of the army's auxiliary guilds. They weren't just random camp followers. They were part of a state-sanctioned organization with their own hierarchy and strict quality control laws. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The Janissary butchers were legally required to follow the army into the very mouth of hell. During a siege, if the front lines moved forward into a breach, the butchers were expected to set up their blocks just behind the fighting so that the men could be fed fresh meat the moment the fighting paused. You aren't just a soldier. You are the customer of a mobile, high-speed protein factory that operates under fire. Historians still argue whether the presence of such a specialized and protected butcher-esque guild made the Ottoman army less adaptable to living off the land because they were so dependent on their professional supply chain. To you, watching the Kasab work, the question seems absurd. Why would you want to live off the land like a starving bandit when you can have a professional butcher ensure your meat is handled with the proper respect. There is a gentle sarcasm in the way you watch a new recruit turn pale at the sight of the blood. "Don't worry, boy," you call out, "that's not your blood yet. That's just the Sultan, making sure you have the strength to keep your own inside your skin tomorrow." The kasab also held a unique judicial power, because meat was the primary currency of Janissary loyalty. A butcher accused of giving short weight or providing low-quality gray meat was subject to immediate and brutal punishment. You've heard stories of butchers being executed on their own chopping blocks for trying to sell the best cuts to the officers while leaving the soup bones for the rank and file. This enforced honesty is the reason you trust the man with the knife. He is the guardian of your caloric rights. In the Ottoman world, the butcher's scale was as much a symbol of justice as the judge's bench. There is an open scholarly debate phrase that often appears in military logistics papers. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman reliance on fresh slaughtered meat, rather than salted preserves, was the hidden vulnerability that limited their campaigning season to the months when grazing was available for the herds. You feel the reality of this every autumn. When the grass turns brown, the shadow of the butcher begins to retreat toward Istanbul, and the army must follow. Your stomach dictates the calendar of conquest. You are a Janissary, a creature of the fresh hearth, and you cannot thrive on the dry, salted husks that sustain the Western armies. As the morning progresses, the butcher finishes his work, and the portions are carted off to the various okak kitchens. He wipes his blade on a whetstone, the metallic shing-shing sound, a sharp punctuation to the camp's morning bustle. You look at the man, his face stoic and his hands stained with the lifeblood of the empire. He is the silent partner in your glory. The general wins the battle, but the butcher provides the muscle to swing the sword. You feel a strange sense of kinship with him. You both deal in the business of the blade. He just does his work before the battle begins. The evening meal will be rich. Tonight, the butcher has found a particularly fetailed breed of sheep from the eastern provinces. You can already smell the first hint of the rendering fat from the distant kitchens. You tuck your spoon into your cap, the wood a clean contrast to the gritty reality of the camp. The shadow of the Janissary butcher has passed over you once again, leaving you with the fuel you need for another day of the Sultan's work. You are a man of the hearth, and as long as the butcher's knife is sharp, your heart will remain strong. You are standing in the middle of a cavernous warehouse near the docks of the Golden Horn, and the air here is so sharp and crystalline it makes your eyes water. Before you are stacks of white glittering blocks that look more like marble than food. This is the salt, the hidden currency of the Ottoman Empire. In your world, salt isn't just something you sprinkle on a hard-boiled egg, it is the chemical anchor of the state. Without these crystals, the millions of sheep we've talked about would rot before they reached the front, and the Sultan's authority would dissolve like sugar in the rain. You probably wouldn't survive a week working in the salt mines of Wallachia or Anatolia, where the air eats your lungs and the labor is so grueling, it's often used as a death sentence. The mainstream historical fact is that salt was a state-controlled monopoly of the highest order. The Tuzla salt works were guarded with the same intensity as the imperial treasury, because the ability to preserve food was the ability to wage long-term war. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The Janissaries had a specialized salt taster in each regiment. His job was to ensure the salt hadn't been cut with gypsum or sand by corrupt contractors. If the salt was bad, the pastourma cured beef would spoil. And a Janissary with spoiled meat is a Janissary with a loaded musket pointed at the palace. You aren't just a soldier, you are a consumer of a strategic mineral that dictates the very reach of your empire. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman control of the major salt routes through the Balkans and the Red Sea was a more significant factor in their dominance than their gunpowder technology. To you, leaning against a rough-hewn salt crate, the logic is simple. Gunpowder kills the enemy, but salt keeps the friend alive. You see a palace official checking the seals on the shipments. There is a gentle sarcasm in the way you watch him. "Careful with that, Effendi," you call out. If you drop a grain, you might have to explain to the soup maker why the winter rations taste like the bottom of a birdcage. He doesn't look up, but you see his hand tremble slightly as he marks his ledger. The salt covenant we keep mentioning is literally built on this substance. To eat a man's salt is to be chemically and spiritually bound to him. It is a preservative for loyalty. You realize that your entire identity as a Janissary is pickled in this mineral. It's in the peximet that stays dry for months. It's in the olives that fuel your morning march. It's in the very sweat that stings your eyes during a cavalry charge. You are a man made of salt and steel. There is an open scholarly debate phrase that often pops up in economic history. Historians still argue whether the rising price of salt in the 18th century was the primary catalyst for the widespread military desertions that plagued the later Ottoman campaigns. You've felt that pinch. When the salt becomes too expensive, the meat becomes lean and the loyalty becomes thin. But tonight, the warehouse is full. The supply lines are open. The Sultan has secured the mines, and that means the campaign will go forward. As you walk back to the barracks, passing the salty spray of the Bosporus, you feel a sense of permanence. The salt ensures that the harvest of the summer survives the hunger of the winter. It is the silent white pulse of the logistics machine. You tuck your spoon into your cap, feeling the grit of the air on your skin. You are a Janissary, a man of the hearth, and as long as the Sultan provides the salt, you will provide the preservation of his borders. The empire is seasoned, stable, and ready for the next march. The air in the mess hall is unusually thick tonight, but it's not from the steam of the lintels. You are standing along the perimeter of the room, your back against the stone pillar, watching a circle of men gather in the center. In any other army, a crime would be handled by a provost marshal or a hanging judge in a wig. But here, the kitchen is a court of law. At the head of the long wooden table sits the aşçi-başi, the head cook, holding a massive iron ladle across his knees like a scepter of justice. Before him, a young recruit stands with his head bowed, accused of striking a comrade during the morning bread distribution. You probably wouldn't survive the judgment of the ladle. There are no lawyers here, and the judge knows exactly how much you've been eating and how well you've been working. The mainstream historical fact is that the Janissary barracks were autonomous zones, where the civil laws of the Sultan rarely applied. The corps governed itself through a system of internal discipline, rooted in the hierarchy of the hearth. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The punishments were often symbolically linked to the kitchen. A soldier who committed a minor offense might be sentenced to water-carrying duty for a month, but a more serious offender could be forced to sleep on the kitchen floor, face down as a sign of his unworthiness to sit at the communal table. You aren't just a soldier. You are a member of a guild where the head chef can decide if you refit for the front line or the scullery. Historians still argue whether this internal judicial system made the Janissaries more disciplined by creating a family sense of shame, or if it allowed them to become a state within a state, hiding criminals from the Sultan's reach. For you, watching the aşçi-başi lean forward, the power is undeniable. He doesn't look at a law book. He looks at the boy's record of service. There is a gentle sarcasm in the way the cook speaks. So, you thought your hunger was more important than the okak's peace. Perhaps you need a few days of fasting to remember who truly fills your belly. The recruit doesn't dare look up. In the Janissary world, being cast out of the table is a social death sentence. The kitchen, as a court of law, was a remarkably efficient system, because the officers lived, ate, and breathed alongside their men. There was no evidence to gather the truth was already known by the hearth. You realize that this is why the Janissaries are so terrifyingly cohesive in battle. If you can trust your judge to be fair with the soup, you can trust your general to be fair with your life. The ladle is the gavel, and its strike is final. You see the aşçi-başi signal to the karakaluku, the scullery assistants, and the recruit is led away to begin his penance. Justice has been served before the first bowl of pilaf is even poured. There is an open, scholarly debate phrase that often surfaces in legal histories of the Ottoman Empire. Historians still argue whether the Janissaries' refusal to submit to external courts was the primary cause of the breakdown in the Ottoman rule of law during the 18th century. You, however, feel a sense of security in it. You don't want a bureaucrat from the city deciding your fate. You want the man who knows your name and your appetite. The hearth is a place of warmth, but it is also a place of searing heat for those who break the salt covenant. As the trial ends and the atmosphere lightens, the aşçi-başi stands up and returns the ladle to the soup pot. The court is adjourned and dinner is back on the menu. You take your place in the circle, feeling the familiar weight of the spoon in your cap. You look around at your brothers. The order has been restored, the grievance has been settled, and the family is whole again. You are a Janissary, and your law is as simple and nourishing as the bread you are about to break. The night deepens, and the sounds of eating the rhythmic clack of wood on ceramic fill the hall. It is the sound of a functioning society. You realize that as long as the kitchen remains the center of justice, the regiment will remain a fortress. You tuck your spoon back into its slot, satisfied. The judge has spoken, the soup is hot, and the empire, for one more night, is under control. The air in the barracks is no longer filled with the crisp, professional energy of a functioning army. Instead, it smells of stale grease and the lingering scent of smoke from poorly maintained fires. You are standing by the main gate, watching a man in a fine silk kaftan climb out of a carriage. He carries no weapons, his hands are soft, and he looks like he hasn't missed a meal in his entire life. To your horror, he is greeted by the guards, not as a visitor, but as a superior officer of the kitchen. This is the decline of the culinary elite. This man has just purchased the title of Axkabak for a handful of gold. Despite the fact that he probably couldn't tell a lentil from a pebble, you probably wouldn't survive the frustration of this era, where the sacred rank of the soup maker has been reduced to a line item in a merchant's ledger. The mainstream historical fact is that by the late 18th century, the Janissary Corps had become so corrupt that ghost soldiers and paper officers dominated the roles. Rich civilians bought Janissary certificates, asaimed, to enjoy tax exemptions and state protection, without ever stepping foot in a barracks or touching a ladle. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The corruption was so deep that some of these kitchen officers actually hired poor street performers to show up on paydays and wear their uniforms just to keep the appearance of a functioning unit. You aren't just a soldier, you are a witness to the hollowing out of a legend. You look at your own kazan, the once-noble copper, now pitted with green corrosion because no one bothered to polish it this week. Historians still argue whether the Janissaries' transition from a warrior caste to a guild of petty merchants was an inevitable result of the empire's economic inflation, or a deliberate sabotage by the Sultan's court to weaken a political rival. For you, the reason matters less than the reality. The Salt Covenant is being traded for paper and promises. You see the veteran Korbak, the real one, staring at the silk-clad merchant with a look of pure, concentrated venom. There is a gentle sarcasm in the way the old soldier whispers, "Careful, Excellency, don't get too close to the fire. We wouldn't want the scent of honest work to ruin your expensive perfume." It's a bitter joke, but it's the only weapon left in the barracks. The decline of the culinary elite also meant the decline of the menu. The meticulous logistics we talked about, the millions of sheep, the fresh salt, the proximate quality control, have been replaced by a system of kickbacks and creative accounting. The mutton in the pot tonight is stringy and old, likely bought at a discount from a butcher who is in debt to the new kitchen merchant. You realize that a military that defines itself by the hearth cannot survive when the fire is being sold to the highest bidder. The hierarchy of the spoon, once a symbol of merit, has become a hierarchy of the purse. There is an open scholarly debate phrase that haunts this period. Historians still argue whether the Janissary Corps by 1800 was more of a national labor union or an organized crime syndicate than a military force. You feel the weight of that truth as you watch the new officer hand out pay packets. Taking a cut from each one as a service fee, the discipline that once terrified Europe has dissolved into a squabble over market stalls and tobacco licenses. You are a Janissary, but the title feels like a costume. The kazan, which was once your flag, is now just a convenient place for the merchants to hide their contraband. As the evening meal is served a watery, flavorless mess that even the soka looks at with pity, you feel a sense of impending doom. You tuck your spoon into your cap, but it no longer feels like a badge of honor. It feels like a relic of a dead age. The culinary elite are gone, replaced by culinary investors. You look at the palace on the hill, and you can almost feel the Sultan's patience finally reaching its boiling point. The hearth is cooling, the soup is thinning, and you know that an army that can no longer feed its own honor is an army that is waiting for its final meal. The air in Istanbul is not thick with the scent of spices or roasting mutton today. It is thick with the smell of wet gunpowder and the metallic temps of fear. You are standing in the center of the Et Medani, the meat square. But the familiar rhythm of the barracks has been replaced by a desperate, jagged energy. You are surrounded by thousands of your brothers, and in the center of the square, the great kazans have been overturned one last time. This is not a protest for better meat. This is a standoff for the very soul of the Janissary. But across the square, the view has changed. You aren't facing the Sultan's messengers or a few palace guards. You are staring down the muzzles of modern cannons, manned by the Nizami Sedid, the new order troops you once mocked. You probably wouldn't survive the first 10 seconds of this encounter, as the age of the spoon is about to be violently erased by the age of the grape shot. The mainstream historical fact is that on June 15, 1826, Sultan Mahmud II orchestrated the auspicious incident Vakai Hayrai, the cold-blooded and total destruction of the Janissary Corps. He had finally built an army capable of destroying his own guards. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. When the Janissaries realized they were trapped, they retreated into their barracks and began to cook. Even in the face of certain death, they returned to the hearth, thinking that the sacred status of their kitchen would act as a sanctuary that even the Sultan would dare violate. You aren't just a soldier in a coup. You are a man clinging to a kitchen that has become a tomb. Historians still argue whether the auspicious incident was a necessary surgery to save a dying empire or a brutal massacre that robbed the Ottomans of their most traditional social anchor. For you, as the first cannonball screams through the air and shatters the stone archway of the barracks, the debate is over. The new order artillerymen, whom you called toy soldiers, are now methodically leveling the very buildings where the Salt Covenant was born. There is a gentle sarcasm in the way the world has turned. "Look at that," you mutter to a comrade as a shell ignites a sack of flour, creating a white, dusty explosion. The Sultan finally found a way to bake the bread faster. It's the last joke you'll ever make. The kitchen as a fortress has failed. The fires that once cooked the Sultan's pilaf are now consuming the wooden rafters of your home. You see the Akskabak head cook standing by his kazan, his ladle still tucked into his belt even as the walls crumble around him. He represents a world where the hearth was the center of the universe, but the universe has just expanded to include industrial warfare. You realize that the Salt Covenant wasn't broken by the Janissaries. It was liquidated by a sultan who decided that a modern state couldn't be held hostage by a soup pot. There is an open, scholarly debate phrase that resonates through the smoke. Historians still argue whether the total erasure of the Janissaries left a cultural vacuum in Istanbul that was eventually filled by a sterile, westernized bureaucracy. You see that vacuum opening in real time as the flames lick the sacred cauldrons, turning the polished copper into a blackened, warped ruin. The history of 500 years is being cauterized. You are a Janissary, and your hearth is now a pyre. The Sultan's new order doesn't want guests. It wants soldiers who don't ask about the quality of the mutton. As the smoke grows too thick to breathe, you look at the spoon tucked into your felt cap. It is scorched and splintered. The auspicious incident is the final meal of the Corps, and it consists of nothing but fire and iron. You realize that you aren't just dying for a privilege or a pay rate, you are dying for a way of life where a man was defined by the people he ate with. You take one last look at the kazan before the roof collapses. It was the heart of everything, and now the heart is cold. The sounds of the battle begin to fade into the roar of the fire. The square where the Metax riots once raged is now a graveyard of felt caps and broken ladles. You are a Janissary, and the auspicious incident has served the final course. The age of the warrior cook is over, and as you drift into the final darkness, you realize that the world will never again know an army that marched on the strength of a sacred soup. The smoke over the Etmadani has finally cleared, leaving behind a silence so heavy it feels like a physical weight on the city. You are no longer standing in the heat of the fire, but rather, you are a ghost of the history you once inhabited. The barracks are rubble, the new order soldiers are patrolling the streets in their flat fezzes and buttoned tunics. And the sacred cauldrons, the noble kazans that once dictated the fate of the throne, have been melted down to make cannonballs, or sold as scrap metal. You are looking at the echo of the overturned pot, the final residue of a world where the kitchen was the center of power. You probably wouldn't survive the psychological shift of this new Istanbul, where the Salt Covenant has been replaced by cold. Bureaucratic contracts and the rhythmic clack of the soup spoon is a forbidden sound. The mainstream historical fact is that after 1826, Sultan Mahmud II didn't just kill the Janissaries, he attempted to erase them from memory. He banned their dress, their titles, and even the Bektashi dervish order that served as their spiritual kitchen staff. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit. For decades after the massacre, secret hearth societies existed in the back alleys of Istanbul. Former Janissaries and their sympathizers would meet in private homes to share a bowl of pilaf in total silence, using the old culinary hand signals to communicate. You aren't just a fallen soldier. You are the source of a lingering underground nostalgia. The empire tried to delete the spoon, but the flavor of the old ways lingered in the city's soul. Historians still argue whether the Janissaries' obsession with the kitchen was the very thing that made them obsolete, as it tethered them to a medieval sense of communal identity in an age of individualistic industrial warfare. To you, looking back through the mists of time, that obsolescence was actually your greatest strength. It was the Pilaf oath and the shared kazan that turned a collection of tribute children into brothers who would die for one another. There is a gentle sarcasm in how history remembers you. You are often portrayed as the villain of Ottoman progress, but they forget that for 500 years, it was your hunger that fed the empire's expansion. The echo of your existence can still be found in the language and the kitchens of the modern world. Every time someone speaks of a hearth as a home, or a company of men from the Latin campaign with bread, they are tapping into the same energy that fueled your orda. You realize that while the Sultan destroyed the men, he couldn't destroy the philosophy. The Ottoman army changed history not just because of its cannons, but because it mastered the logistics of human loyalty. The kitchen was the first true military welfare state, a system that recognized that a soldier's spirit is located exactly 3 inches above his belt. There is an open scholarly debate phrase that serves as your epitaph. Historians still argue whether the fall of the Janissaries was the true beginning of the end for the Ottoman Empire, as the state lost the unique social glue that bonded the military to the common people. You see the sterile, westernized future of the 19th century army, and it lacks the warmth of the fire. The auspicious incident was a victory for the state, but a loss for the family. You are the Janissary, the man of the noble cauldron, and your story ends not with a bang, but with the hollow ring of an empty pot. As the sun sets one last time over the golden horn, the imagery of the barracks fades. You see the axkabak setting down his ladle, the saka emptying his water skin, and the kassab cleaning his blade. The feast is over. The unlocking of the past has revealed a truth that is both simple and profound. Battles are won by generals, but empires are sustained by the kitchen. You take a final breath of the Istanbul air, and for a fleeting moment, you smell it, the faint, ghostly scent of saffron and wood smoke drifting from a hearth that no longer exists. The final wind down now, as the embers of the great Janissary fires grow dim and the clanging of the copper pots fades into the soft velvet silence of the night. It is time for us to step away from the heat of the barracks. The long marches through the Balkan snows and the sun-drenched courtyards of the Topkapi are behind us now. Feel the weight of the day lifting from your shoulders. Much like the heavy felt cap of the soldier being set aside at the end of a long watch, the air around you is cool and still, far removed from the steam of the kazan or the smoke of the trenches. Let your thoughts drift like the thin white plumes of a dying cooking fire, rising slowly toward a clear, star-filled sky. There is no more need for the salt covenant or the peximet of the road. You are safe, you are warm, and the history we have walked through is now just a collection of peaceful shadows. The empire has found its rest, and the hearth is finally at peace. Breathe in the quiet of the room, feeling the soft background hum of the world around you, and let yourself sink into the comfort of the present moment. The story is told, the journey is complete, and the legends of the warrior cooks are tucked away in the archives of the mind. Sleep now, knowing that the noble cauldron is still, the ladle is at rest, and the journey is over.